Science is supposed to be the ultimate search for truth. No forbidden questions. Just follow the evidence wherever it leads. That's the promise, right? Well, that's what we were taught in school. That's what we see in documentaries and textbooks. Science is neutral. Science is humble. Science just wants to know what's real. But what if that promise is broken? What if modern science has been quietly hijacked, not by evidence, but by an invisible rulebook that says only natural answers are allowed? A rule that says no matter how strong the evidence, you cannot conclude God, or miracle, or design. A rule that doesn't come from logic or experiment, but from a philosophical bias dressed up as science. Here's the problem. When you apply that rule to origins, the beginning of the universe, the origin of life, the question of whether miracles can happen, you're not doing neutral science anymore. You're rigging the game. You're telling half the players they can't win before the match even starts. And here's the kicker. The founders of modern science, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Boyle, they didn't play by those rules. They were theists. They believed in God, and they thought science was a way to understand His creation. So what changed? Who rewrote the rules? And why does it matter for you, for your faith, and for the future of our civilization? And here's where we uncover the foundation. Here's the heart of the issue. Mainstream science operates under something called methodological naturalism. That's a fancy way of saying when doing science, you must only look for natural causes. No miracles, no God, no supernatural explanations allowed. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. After all, science studies nature. But here's the catch. Methodological naturalism is a rule, not a proven fact. It assumes nature is all there is for the purpose of the investigation. But when that rule is applied to questions about origins, how the universe began and where all life came from, whether miracles can happen, it rigs the game from the start. And if you're not allowed to conclude God did it, even if the evidence points that way, then your method is biased. That's not science. That's philosophy, pretending to be science. Now watch how inconsistent this becomes. The Big Bang Theory, widely taught as fact, cannot be observed, tested, or repeated. No one was there. You cannot run the experiment again. Yet it's treated as settled science. Multiverse theory, absolutely zero empirical evidence. Completely speculative. Yet it's discussed seriously in academic journals. But intelligent design, a miracle recorded in history, the idea that a creator might be the best explanation for the origin of life or the fine-tuning of the universe, those are dismissed, mocked, or simply not allowed to be published. That is a double standard, and it reveals the truth. The problem isn't the evidence. The problem is the conclusion. If the conclusion sounds even a little bit like God, the gatekeepers shut it down. It wasn't always this way. The founders of modern science, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Boyle, Faraday, Maxwell, Pasteur, were not naturalists. They were theists. They were devout Christians. They believed they were studying God's creation. For them, natural laws existed because God established and sustained them. Miracles were not ruled out. They were understood as God acting outside the normal course of nature. So what happened? The shift began in the late 1700s and accelerated through the 1800s. Enlightenment philosophers like Hume argued miracles were inherently unbelievable, not because they examined any specific miracle, but because they assumed nature was a closed system. German biblical critics began treating Scripture as a purely human document. Then came Darwin, and figures like T.H. Huxley actively promoted the idea that science and religion were at war. a narrative historians now call the conflict thesis, which was largely invented for polemical purposes. By the early 1900s, methodological naturalism had been formalized as the working rule of science, but over time it quietly became something else: metaphysical naturalism, the belief that nature is all there is. The rule became a worldview, and anyone who questioned it was pushed to the margins. This isn't just an academic debate. It has real consequences for society. When a nation systematically removes God from public life and moral foundations, it becomes dangerously vulnerable. Without God, morality becomes a matter of human opinion, cultural consensus, or state decree. There is no transcendent standard to appeal to when the powerful decide who counts as human and who doesn't. Judeo-Christian ethics introduced the idea that every person has dignity because they are made in the image of God, regardless of usefulness, race, or ability. Remove that foundation, and what protects the weak, the disabled, the unborn? The 20th century's worst atrocities, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Maoist China, all occurred in governments that were officially atheist or aggressively secular. Now, that doesn't mean secularism causes genocide, but it strongly suggests that removing God does not protect a nation from evil. In fact, it removes the most powerful check on state power. Even Richard Dawkins, the world's most famous atheist, has admitted he would rather live in a Christian nation than a purely secular one. He calls himself a cultural Christian now. Why? Because he sees that the Christian moral framework, even without the belief, produces better outcomes, more human dignity, more freedom, more compassion. This brings us to America. The atheist claim is that the United States is a secular nation, but that's a distortion of history. The Constitution itself is carefully worded: no national church, no religious test for office, but the Declaration of Independence grounds rights in nature's God and the Creator. The founders assumed God existed. They believed rights came from God, not government. They built laws on a Judeo-Christian moral framework. They saw Christianity as essential for virtue and liberty. The First Amendment was never meant to purge God from public life. The same Congress that passed it also opened sessions with prayer, funded chaplains, and printed Bibles for schools. That's not a secular nation. That's a nation without an official church. When atheists claim America is secular, they're afraid of one word: theocracy. But no one is asking for a theocracy. Recognizing that America was consecrated to God, that it was founded as a Christian nation in its cultural and moral foundation, is not the same as demanding forced prayer or biblical law. The fear is not really about theocracy. The fear is about God. Because if America was founded on the assumption that God is real and morality is authoritative, then removing him isn't neutrality, it's rebellion. So here's where we land. Science was not created by naturalists. It was created by theists who believed an orderly universe required an orderly lawgiver. The naturalists inherited that legacy, rewrote the rules, and now pretend that their philosophy is the only rational game in town. But the evidence doesn't care about their rules. The fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life, the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. These are not arguments from ignorance. They are positive cases that point toward a creator. The real choice between us is not science versus religion. It's honesty versus bias. Do we follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it takes us beyond nature? Or do we lock ourselves inside a self-imposed box and call it science? One path is open to truth. The other is a closed system that protects a worldview at all costs. So here's my challenge to you. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, next time someone tells you that science has disproven God, or that miracles are impossible, or that intelligent design isn't scientific, ask them one question. What rule are you using, and who decided it? Because if the rule says only natural explanations allowed, then the conclusion was baked in from the beginning. That's not discovery, that's a filter. And the truth doesn't need a filter, it just needs an open mind. If you want to know more about God and about Jesus Christ and the salvation that He's offering you today, then I strongly suggest you watch this video on the gospel message. It will lead you through the reasons why we need salvation and how you can have it today. Join us next time as we keep uncovering the foundations.